She got too close. And then she sank her teeth into the royal guard's leg. The crowd froze in horror, but his reaction left everyone speechless. What happened next shocked even the police.
Be sure to subscribe to the channel, and let's promote respect for the Royal Guard together. Let the whole world see how many of us there are.
London was bustling as usual. Double-decker buses sped through the streets, pedestrians hurried along busy sidewalks, and outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd of tourists had gathered, just as they did every day. People clutched their smartphones and cameras, eager to capture every moment. Some listened excitedly to tour guides, others laughed while observing the motionless guards, and many impatiently awaited the famous changing of the guard. But she stood out from the rest. A woman in her 40s, tall, thin, dressed in a long green coat, an odd choice for the warm weather. A wide-brimmed hat sat awkwardly atop her head, slightly tilted to one side, with messy blonde strands poking out from underneath. She didn't look like a typical tourist. She wasn't holding a phone, wasn't taking pictures, and unlike the others, she wasn't smiling. Instead, she clutched a small notebook tightly in her hands, occasionally jotting down frantic notes in tiny, nervous handwriting. Every now and then, her lips moved soundlessly as if she were whispering to herself. She didn't seem excited to be there. Her sharp, predatory gaze wasn't fixed on the palace, nor on the grand gates of the monarchy. It was locked onto the guards. Directly in front of her, stationed behind the barrier, stood Lieutenant James Carlyle, a 29-year-old soldier who had served in the Royal Guard with unwavering dedication for the past 5 years. He was tall, well-built, and carried himself with flawless posture. His chiseled features bore the unmistakable imprint of discipline. His red tunic fit perfectly, and his towering bearskin hat only amplified his commanding presence. He didn't blink. He didn't move. The woman began creeping closer to the barrier. Too close. Her eyes widened as she slowly lowered her gaze, down to his boots. She froze. A strange obsession flickered in her expression. Her lips moved slightly as if she were counting something. And then, she bent forward. The crowd started whispering. Tourists noticed her bizarre behavior. "What is she doing?" a young woman murmured, gripping her companion's arm. "Maybe she's checking if they're real?" A guy chuckled, but there was uncertainty in his voice. The woman crouched lower, her face now inches from the guard's boots. James Carlyle didn't react, not even the slightest twitch. But inside he was on high alert. In all his years of service, he had dealt with countless provocations. But never had someone knelt before him and inspected his legs with such an eerie intensity. The crowd fell silent, and someone had already started recording on their phone. The tension in the air became almost tangible. She leaned in even closer. Something completely illogical was unfolding before the eyes of hundreds of people, but no one could have predicted what would happen next. Buckingham Palace had seen it all. Every day, hundreds of tourists flocked to its gates, some eager to capture the changing of the guard on camera, others pulling faces at the guards, hoping to provoke a reaction, and a few even daring to climb over the barriers, testing the patience of security. But what happened today was beyond anything the palace had ever witnessed. The woman in the long green coat was still standing right up against the barrier. Her figure stood out against the lively, bustling crowd, not because of what she was doing, but because she wasn't doing anything at all. Around her, people were laughing, chatting, taking selfies. But she seemed deaf to the world. Her body was locked in a state of eerie stillness. Her gaze, it was locked onto the guard's boots. She wasn't taking pictures, she wasn't speaking, she wasn't smiling. She didn't even look like a tourist. Her lips were moving silently, whispering something under her breath, but her words were swallowed up by the noise of the square. And then, she slowly tilted her head to the side, as if listening to something only she could hear. A security officer took notice of her strange behavior. "Ma'am, please step back," he said firmly, taking a step toward her. But she didn't move. Her eyes remained wide open. Her lips continued their silent movement. And then, she very, very slowly turned her head to look at the security officer. And she smiled. But it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too unnatural, like a painted-on expression on a doll, one that didn't quite match reality. The people nearby noticed. The crowd began whispering, those standing closest to her watching with growing unease. And then, something happened that made everyone's blood run cold. She suddenly took a step forward. The crowd froze. The air grew thick with tension. Some instinctively stepped back, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. But that wasn't even the strangest part. The woman dropped to her knees in front of the guard. "What the?" Gasps erupted from the crowd. "Is she praying? Is this some kind of ritual?" But it was much, much worse. She slowly bent even lower. Her face was now just inches from the guard's boot. Lieutenant James Carlyle did not move, but he felt a deep tension rise within him. In 5 years of service, he had witnessed countless bizarre stunts from tourists, but never anything like this. She wasn't just looking at his boots. There was a strange, almost obsessive determination in her eyes. Her neck stretched forward. Her fingers trembled, and in the next instant, she latched onto his leg. The crowd gasped. A hush fell over the square. And then came the whispers. But it wasn't over yet. The woman dropped even lower and sank her teeth into the leather of his boot. A sickening, wet, squelching sound echoed through the air. She had actually bitten him. For a fraction of a second, the entire square stood still, and then a piercing scream shattered the silence. "Oh my God, she bit him!" The crowd erupted. People recoiled. Some shut their eyes, others covered their mouths in shock. "She's insane! Somebody stop her! This isn't normal!" But the woman did not let go. Her jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in her neck strained. Her breathing became ragged, erratic. Her fingers trembled, but her grip was unrelenting. It was as if she was trying to prove something. James Carlyle could feel the pressure of her teeth through the thick leather of his boot. He knew that physically, the bite couldn't pierce the material, but the sheer absurdity of what was happening. It was teetering on the edge of reality and madness. But he did not move. Even now, as chaos erupted around him, as everyone else lost control of their emotions, he remained still. And then, at the exact moment several horrified screams burst from the crowd, the royal security officers lunged at the woman. The crowd stood frozen in shock. It was as if no one could believe what they were seeing. A woman in a long green coat had literally sunk her teeth into the boot of a royal guard. Her fingers were digging into the fabric of his uniform, her nails pressing into the rough material. Her jaw was clenched so tightly it seemed she had no intention of letting go, no matter what. Bystanders, tourists, security guards, all of them stared in horror, unsure of what to do. Frightened screams rang out around the square. Some people covered their mouths in disbelief, while others scrambled to hit record on their phones, desperate to capture this absurd, bizarre, and terrifying moment. 2 officers sprang into action, their movements sharp and precise, the kind of efficiency that only comes from extensive training. One of them grabbed the woman by the arm, the other seized her by the shoulder and yanked her backward. But she wouldn't let go. Her body resisted with an unnatural strength. Her head jerked violently, her teeth still clamped onto the boot. Lieutenant James Carlyle did not move. He felt the strange pressure on his leg. He understood that something beyond ordinary experience was happening, but he knew his duty. Not a single muscle on his face twitched, even as her teeth continued pressing into the leather. The officers did not hold back. One of them twisted her arm behind her back, while the other yanked her shoulder hard, ripping her away from the boot. A sickening, wet sound followed, like something sticky being peeled apart. The woman let out a sharp, high-pitched scream. But it wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of triumph. Her eyes burned with wild fanaticism, and her lips curled into a twisted smile. She threw her head back, her breathing erratic, almost excited, and then suddenly burst into hysterical laughter. The crowd recoiled. People stared at her in panic, as if they were looking at something unnatural, something wrong. The cameras kept rolling, but no one knew what to do. The woman jerked violently in the officer's grip, trying to break free. Her lips trembled with excitement, her breath hitched, but her eyes gleamed with eerie, unsettling joy. She threw her mouth open wide, as if about to make a grand announcement. And then she screamed at the top of her lungs, "He's real! He's real!" The shock rippled through the crowd. The officers pulled her back, but she kept shouting incomprehensible things. Her face was twisted with ecstasy. She was laughing, as if she had just discovered the greatest secret of the universe. James remained standing, his face just as cold and composed as before. But now his gaze was locked forward, unblinking, as if he was forcing himself to suppress any reaction at all. The crowd started murmuring, fragments of confused voices breaking through the tension. "What the hell? She's insane. Is this some kind of performance? Did she seriously just bite him?" But no one understood what had just happened. The officers exchanged glances. One of them pulled out a radio, speaking urgent commands into it. The crowd began to split, some people backing away in fear, while others pushed forward, desperate to see with their own eyes. But one thing was clear to everyone. This wasn't just bizarre behavior anymore. This was a nightmare. The crowd buzzed with excitement, captivated by the unprecedented spectacle. No one was leaving. They stood frozen in place, afraid to miss even a second of this bizarre performance. Some were still staring in stunned silence. Others chuckled nervously, unable to believe their eyes. A few shook their heads in disgust, struggling to comprehend how something like this could even happen. But the strangest part? The woman refused to surrender. She thrashed like a wounded animal, jerking, twisting in the grip of the guards. Her body convulsed in erratic spasms, fingers clawing at the air as if grasping for something invisible. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. Her lips trembled, but her eyes burned with pure, unhinged fanaticism. And then, through the chaotic murmurs of the crowd, footsteps, heavy, confident, rhythmic. The police. 2 men, clad in black gloves, their faces cold and unreadable, strode toward her with steady, deliberate movements. They wasted no time. One of them snapped his hand up in a sharp gesture. "Let her go!" The guards obeyed instantly, releasing their hold and handing the woman over to the officers. But the moment the police touched her, she screamed. "Don't touch me!" Her voice cracked in a hysterical shriek, barely human. "I had to be sure!" And then, a metallic click. The cuffs snapped shut around her wrists. Cold steel clamped down, final and unyielding. Without hesitation, the officers spun her around and forced her arms behind her back. She gasped, writhing in a final desperate struggle, her feet scraping against the stone pavement. But no one cared about her resistance anymore. The crowd erupted. Some clapped, some cheered, some simply stood there, hands over their mouths, still grappling with the insanity of it all. A police officer spoke, his voice firm and commanding. "You are under arrest for assaulting a member of the Royal Guard." But the woman, she wasn't finished. She kept screaming. Her voice was almost prophetic, wild and frantic. "You don't understand. He's not just a guard. I had to check. He's real! He's real! Her face twisted with desperation. Her gaze darted wildly, lips forming incoherent phrases, her breath labored and ragged, as if she were drowning in her own obsession. The officers didn't listen. They didn't speak. They simply led her away, dragging her toward the waiting patrol car. She struggled, she fought, but her strength was fading. Her resistance was dying. All that remained was obsession. "Let me go! I've done nothing wrong!" she screeched one last time. But the officer placed a firm hand on her shoulder, forcing her to bend forward. Checkmate. For a brief moment, absolute silence. The entire square seemed to hold its breath. Hundreds of eyes watched as the woman was shoved into the back of the police car. Her body slumped onto the seat, her head lolled forward. She tried to scream again, but her voice was gone. A dull slam. The door shut. No more shouting. No more outrage. Only whispers. Hundreds of cameras remained fixed on the patrol car, but one person had not changed. James Carlyle, the Royal Guard. He was still standing. He had not moved an inch. Even after a woman sank her teeth into his boot, even after all the chaos that followed. Unmoving. Unshaken. But there was one detail that could not be ignored. His boot. It was still stained with the saliva of a madwoman. And yet, James did not flinch. He had endured it all. But what was this? That question hung in the air, unanswered. What was she trying to prove? What kind of experiment was this? And the most important question of all, why? London had never seen a story like this before. The incident at Buckingham Palace was so absurd, so bizarre, that it felt like something out of another world. And yet, it happened in reality, right before the eyes of dozens of tourists. And of course, every second of it was recorded. The video spread across the internet at lightning speed. TikTok exploded. Clips of the incident played over and over. The woman kneeling, leaning toward the boot, and sinking her teeth into it. Some people screamed in horror. Some laughed hysterically. Some tried to explain it scientifically. Twitter, X, was in an uproar. How? Just how does someone even think of doing this? Did she really bite him? Is the guard even human? What was she trying to find? YouTube was instantly flooded with clickbait videos. Crazy tourist attacks guardsman. His reaction is unbelievable. Are they not human? What was she trying to prove? London in shock. Tourist launches bite attack. Questions that made people uneasy. The more people re-watched the video, the more questions arose. Why did she do it? How does someone even come up with this idea? Was it a prank, madness, or something else? Thousands of comments flooded social media, torn between outrage and total confusion. I have never seen anything like this. Is this even legal? That guard is a true professional. I would have collapsed. Is she seriously mentally ill? Why do people do this? How did she even think of doing this? But, among the usual flood of shock and criticism, other types of comments began to appear. What if she knew something? Look at how she spoke. She was searching for something. She wanted to check, is he real? What if the guards aren't human? At first, it sounded like a typical conspiracy theory, but the more people analyzed her words, the more they started to wonder. The woman in custody. A silence that feels disturbing. When she was taken to the station, reporters swarmed the police department. Some were waiting for an explanation. Some demanded punishment. Some hoped to see remorse. But none of that happened. She said nothing. She sat on the bench in her holding cell, completely calm, as if nothing had happened. She didn't scream. She didn't try to justify herself. She showed no emotion. Officers asked her questions. She didn't answer. A psychologist tried to speak with her. She just rocked back and forth. Her lips moved, but she wasn't speaking coherently. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she just stared at the ceiling, as if her mind was somewhere far away. Finally, one of the officers, who had been watching her for hours, sighed and shook his head. He wiped sweat from his brow and muttered under his breath, "Damn, she freaks me out." And really, the more people thought about this case, the more terrifying the real question became. What if she actually knew something? The courtroom was packed. People sat on long wooden benches, leaning toward one another, whispering. Some held phones. Others clutched newspapers with bold headlines about the crazy tourist who bit the guardsman. Reporters froze in anticipation of a sensation. Some adjusted their microphone clips, preparing for live broadcasts. This wasn't just a trial. It was an analysis of the strangest, most shocking event London had ever seen. The woman who enraged the internet was here. She sat on the defendant's bench. The tourist in the green coat, or rather, no longer in it. Her strange, elegant outfit was gone. Now she wore a plain gray prison uniform. Her hat was gone. Her notebook, missing. But something in her had stayed the same. She did not look lost, scared, or regretful. She didn't slouch. She didn't fidget. She didn't bite her lip while waiting for her sentence. She just sat there, still, staring straight ahead. In her eyes, emptiness. No anger, no fear, no regret, nothing. The judge, an older man with silver hair and thin-rimmed glasses, studied the documents before him, flipping through the pages. Then he lifted his head and gave the defendant a piercing look. He knew this case. He had seen the footage. He had read hundreds of press reports. But now this story wasn't just a viral video. It was a criminal trial. His voice was steady and firm. "You are charged with assaulting a member of the Royal Guard and disturbing public order. What do you have to say in your defense?" The woman slowly lifted her eyes. She blinked, as if waking up from a dream. Then she tilted her head slightly to the side, and in a voice calm, soft, almost lifeless, she said, "I just needed to make sure they were real." The room fell dead silent. Journalists froze, pens hovering over their notepads. The jury exchanged nervous glances. A police officer standing beside her coughed awkwardly. The judge raised an eyebrow. He clearly had not expected that answer. "What do you mean?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. The woman shrugged as if the question itself was pointless. "I had to check. I just had to." Someone in the back snickered quietly, but most people sat in stunned silence. Was she mocking them? Or was this insanity? Or something else? The judge sighed heavily, removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and finally spoke. "Your actions were unacceptable. You disrespected tradition, disturbed public order, and caused emotional distress to a serviceman performing his duty. Regardless of your motives, such behavior cannot be tolerated." The woman stared straight ahead. She wasn't afraid. She didn't try to explain. She didn't even blink. The judge continued. "I sentence you to 6 months of community service." The room exhaled in relief. Someone clapped softly. Journalists scrambled to write their headlines. But the strangest part? She didn't protest. She didn't ask for leniency. She didn't try to justify herself. She just nodded, as if she had expected it all along. What happened to the guardsman? Lieutenant James Carlyle continued his service. He refused interviews. He did not appear in the news. He made no statements, but everyone knew his name. Tourists visiting Buckingham Palace now looked at the guards differently. Now, they understood, these men weren't just statues in fancy uniforms. They were symbols of honor, discipline, and resilience. And no one, not even the most insane tourist, could change that.